The stereotype of video games being overly violent and grotesque is mostly an exaggerated piece of fear-mongering, but the one place where it might actually hold some weight is in the horror genre. So yeah, of course, sometimes there are going to be characters, enemies, and indeed protagonists that end up in situations that are way worse than just meeting the Grim Reaper for a cup of tea. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 more horror video game fates worse than death. Number 10. Infected by a parasite, Scorn. Now, almost every H.R. Giger painting looks like somebody is suffering a fate worse than death. As such, it's no surprise that this game, which turns the whole Giger style into a living, breathing world, makes it onto the list. Still, while there are many awful fates in Scorn, the ending stands apart as the most horrific. Throughout the game, you play as a nameless protagonist traversing a bizarre techno-biological landscape. As if the gooey setting wasn't bad enough, you also have to constantly battle against the player character from Act 1 who has become a stalking parasite. Even after you've rid yourself of it, it's still a looming threat. Towards the end of the game, you're inches away from making it through a strange-looking portal when this parasite returns. It assimilates you, keeping you stuck in place and feeding on you with the salvation you'll now never know mere meters away. Scorn is mired in ambiguity, but one thing is painfully clear, and that's how you'd be better off dead than stuck in this position. Number 9. Living inside a dating sim, Doki Doki Literature Club. Now, if you asked a gamer if they'd like to live inside a video game, you'd probably get an enthusiastic hell yeah. But when you think about it, the idea is actually kind of horrifying. Imagine living inside the horrors of Raccoon City or the decrepit city of Yharnam. It would be an actual nightmare. However, perhaps an even worse fate is living inside a dating sim. Doki Doki Literature Club, the bonkers horror game that turns high school dating into a fourth wall breaking nightmare, addresses such a horrible fate. You see, the game's antagonist, Monica, is a sentient being living inside a visual novel, and it's clear the horrendous toll this takes on her. She willingly leads her friends to kill themselves to get close to the player character, and even talks in the final act about how boring and monotonous her life is. She is alone in this world, trapped with thoughtless characters who have no agency, and it must be unbearably lonely. Additionally, if her file gets deleted, her consciousness still exists, and she becomes a sentient entity without a body. And how does any of this sound good at all? Number 8. Having your body hijacked, Observer. The monstrously underrated sci-fi horror Observer presents you with a cyberpunk world where detectives known as observers can hack into people's minds. It's a bleak setting where a techno-plague wiped out thousands and left the world in ruins, and of course you just know that there'll be some horrid fates in this one. In the game, an observer named Daniel receives a strange message from his estranged son, whose name is Adam, that sends him down a twisted path. In the end, he finds his progeny in a digital world, albeit an AI version of him. After some back and forth, the player gets given a choice. They can allow the digital Adam to take over Daniel's body, or tell him to bloody do one. Now, the first of these is inarguably a fate worse than death. The concept of an AI of your dead son taking control of your body with you still alive but unable to control your actions is pure nightmare fuel. The only reason that Daniel might accept this fate is to keep a part of his kid alive, but damn, is it really worth it? No. Number 7. Being a plaything of the entity, Dead by Daylight. Now, death is a thing that haunts Dead by Daylight. Hell, the theme of dying is literally in the title. Still, while being dismembered by a terrifying killer might seem like the worst thing that can happen to the player characters, they'd be lucky for one of these horrid kills to end this nightmare. Dead by Daylight is a co-op-driven asymmetrical survival horror, and upon first glance it seems like there's no real story, with each game being a random occurrence with no link to the others. However, that's not the case, as according to the game's lore, these characters are stuck in a death loop at the whims of an interdimensional being known as the Entity. The survivors never truly die, as whenever they meet their end, they're kept away from death's door and brought back to the strange purgatory created by this eldritch horror. The Entity traps the killers and survivors in a constant round of death games to appease its love of violence and misery. Getting killed just once sounds awful, so imagine it happening every day, all the time, forever. Cool. Number 6. Living as an animatronic, Five Nights at Freddy's. Now, there was a time where the massively popular Five Nights at Freddy's franchise was an utter mystery, with online theorists piecing together the lore and story like a long, convoluted, overly intricate puzzle. However, there have been plenty of answers since then, and one being exactly what the animatronics are, and, it's a horrible fate to think about. Freddy, Chica, Foxy, and more are dead children whose spirits have become trapped inside the characters found at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This happened after the maniacal William Afton, a serial killer and co-founder of of the pizzeria killed them and stuffed them into the suits. Death was only the beginning of their suffering, however, as they now exist forever inside horrendous bodies with the influence of their murderer constantly hanging over them. They attack any adult they see, thinking they might get revenge on their killer, without knowing that he's secretly pulling their strings. Of course, Afton himself faces a fate worse than death also, but no one would blame you for being less sympathetic towards his struggles than the kids he killed. Number 5. Moon Scorched, Fear and Hunger 2, Termina. This entry is somewhat of a buy one get one free, as moon scorching appears in this sick and twisted game in two horrifying ways. God, aren't you lucky? Fear and Hunger 2 Termina is a disturbed RPG that pits characters against each other in a battle royale at the whims of a trickster moon god. And between this and Dead by Daylight, there's a lot of that going around. One cruel trick this maniacal old god pulls is called moon scorching. For most of the townfolk, this means becoming a distorted ghoul-like creature. They maintain a semblance of their humanity, but end up as homicidal maniacs with deformed bodies and minds. However, their named characters, well, they get it much worse. If any main character refuses to partake in the battle royale, they'll become moon-scorched creatures reflective of themselves. For example, the sweet Olivia turns into Mechanical Dance, which fuses her body with her wheelchair to make a sickening mechanical being. Additionally, the headstrong journalist Karen morphs into Valkyrie, a vulture-like monster that reflects her guilt at documenting the horrors of war. Now, these are just two of many, many sickening examples. Number 4. Fused to a Ride, Bendy and the Ink Machine. Carnivals and theme parks are places full of happiness and joy, so naturally there's got to be a horror game out there that contorts this idea into a hellish nightmare. Well, say hello to Bendy and the Ink Machine, as there's a character in this game who proves you don't want to stay at the fair forever. Bertram Piedmont is another victim of Joey Drew Studios' corruption and an example of frightening body horror. He was the creator of Bendyland, the studio's amusement park, and thus ended up trapped in the Bendy cycle as an ironically twisted fairground attraction. His body was fused into a spinning octopus ride with his head encased in the middle of a huge contraption. This rotating nightmare left him stuck in place, unable to get out, forever stationary within this carousel. Now, rides might be a lot of fun, but becoming one and never being able to move again, well, that is a horrendous thought. Thankfully, his boss fight finishes with you ending his misery, well, at least until the cycle starts up again. Number 3. Copied Digital Consciousness, Soma. What kind of game would you expect from the studio behind Amnesia? A survival horror with some monsters to hide from? Yes, that would be right. But you likely didn't expect an existential nightmare with a story so thought-provoking and compelling that it almost hurts. Enter Soma. This sci-fi tale is a thrilling exploration of what makes one human and the moral consequences of copying consciousnesses. It takes place in an underwater facility after the extinction of humanity. In this decrepit location, a misguided artificial intelligence system copies the brain scans of humans and places them inside robotic bodies. Now, while this might sound like a good thing, as it keeps humanity going somewhat, it's really not. Imagine being trapped in an underwater facility with no chance of escape in a metallic body that is essentially a prison. This is a fate that befalls multiple characters. It happens to the protagonist and all of the robots on board who still think that they're humans. If you're afraid of AI, this might be one to avoid, unless you're looking for an effective means to stay up all night. Number 2. The Duty of the Rope Shrine Maiden, Fatal Frame. Okay, so here's a little Fatal Frame 1 lore dump for you. The strangling ritual is a practice performed every 10 years to seal the Hellgate and keep evil spirits from passing through. It requires a girl, chosen via a demonic game of tag, to act as the Rope Shrine Maiden. Once selected, she is locked inside for the next 10 years in total isolation. Eventually, she purifies herself by bathing in the moonlight before her limbs and head are torn from her body by ropes. Those blood-stained ropes are then placed in front of the gate in order to seal it. Yeah, and you thought that your family had strange traditions. That decade of isolation is awful, but the fate that befell the last maiden, Kiri, is even worse. Her strangling ritual failed, causing evil spirits to escape. At the end of the game, she returns to the Hellgate and willingly binds herself to keep it shut. She's then forced to spend the rest of her life confined at the gates in pain and agony. It's the ultimate sacrifice, but also an incredibly sad duty as the Rope Shrine Maiden. And number 1, Stuck in Silent Hill, the Silent Hill series. Yes, this final entry might be vague and all-encompassing, but it couldn't be anything else. Being trapped in the horror-filled place that is Silent Hill is one of gaming's most notorious fates, and many people befall it. Silent Hill is a town that manifests the fears, guilt, and insecurities of those inside it. This titular location traps people among the darkest things inside their heads, essentially making their nightmares come to life, with many of them being entirely unable to escape. And if you need some specific examples, well, let's show you some. There's Lisa from Silent Hill 1. She died before the first game, but found her soul trapped in Silent Hill's otherworld. She eventually discovers that she's dead and will forever remain in this horrifying town full of monsters, unable to achieve a life of her own. Additionally, there's Angela from Silent Hill 2, who is haunted by her abusive father and trapped inside a burning version of the town. I mean, there are plenty more, like cop Cheryl Mason, Cynthia, and Alessa, to name a few, but ultimately, if you end up in Silent Hill, you'd be better off dead and gone.